This is the voiceover presentation for Chapter 1 in the Rothermel textbook, What is Strategy? This chapter covers the course's fundamentals. We begin with key terminology, examine different facets of organizational performance, and review the role of stakeholders in strategy. The objectives of the chapter are to see how key terms form the foundation of understanding strategic decisions and to account for the impact of stakeholders in the consideration of how firms build and implement strategies in the pursuit of sustained organizational performance. So here are several key terms in strategy. I've only provided abbreviated definitions on this slide just to get us started, but I'll cover each of them in greater depth as we move through the presentation. And we'll come back to these terms again and again throughout the term. So take note of them because they will be important to just about everything we do in this course. The simplest definition of the term industry is as a group of firms that share strategic similarities. This sounds straightforward, but there are at least three ways of grouping companies: by the products and services that they sell, the customer needs and wants that they satisfy, or the markets that they serve. We'll use Five Guys as an example. It competes with restaurants like BurgerFi and Yeah Burger in the upscale counter-service burger restaurants, as well as any other restaurant in terms of products and services. In terms of customer needs and wants, it competes with anything that satisfies hunger, which includes eating at home. Geographically, here in Atlanta, Five Guy competes with Yeah Burger and BurgerFi, but not with the famous In-N-Out Burger because In-N-Out has no locations here. A firm's most direct competitors will share all three characteristics. The important point to note here is that there are multiple ways of determining the group of companies that a firm competes with, and this is essential because being precise about a definition of a firm's industry is the starting point for almost all strategic analysis. A business model is a firm's overarching approach to competition in an industry. I'll use book retailers here for a quick example. There are at least three general approaches to selling books: online, like Amazon, in-store chains, like Borders and Half Price Books, and specialty stores, like used bookshops or university bookstores. Notice that while all three of these types of firms sell books, they compete in very different ways. While firms often blur the lines between approaches to doing business in an industry, thinking about these distinctions is a helpful first step. Determining its business model is often a firm's very first act in creating strategy. We're going to use the term strategy in at least three different ways. The first is as a description of a field of study. This course about strategy includes a number of theories, models, and terminology executives use when figuring out how to pursue performance. Just as you learn about money and investments in finance or promotions and buyer behavior in marketing, strategy has its own body of knowledge, which includes seminal frameworks that you've heard of, such as the Five Forces model or core competencies, all of which are focused on explaining and improving firm performance. Our next treatment of the word strategy is in the sense of a firm's strategy, or its overall perspective of how it competes in an industry. You will often hear senior executives of a firm discuss their go-to-market approach, trying to give a general description of how a firm pursues customers and wins against competitors. In doing so, they're summarizing the firm's overall trajectories in the name of strategy. Last, underneath that general strategy, firms will have individual strategies. A strategy can be defined as a sustained initiative used by a firm to achieve a stated goal. And it turns out that firms can have lots of different strategic initiatives going on at one time. For instance, a firm might have a strategy for new product development, one for customer acquisition, another for having an efficient capital structure, among many others. And last, tactics are actions taken to implement a strategic initiative. The collection of a firm's strategies and tactics taken all together are elements of its overall strategy. The text uses the term coherent actions to describe this integration. Because a firm can pursue multiple strategic initiatives at once, a key to overall success is the alignment of those strategies. In the converse, when those strategic initiatives are not properly lined up, the misalignments will detract from a firm's ability to perform. Everything a firm does should fit with one another. The objective is to have all of the initiatives work well with one another, simultaneously being based on the overall strategy as well as contributing to its pursuit of competitive advantage. The last term on my list is strategic management, which is the process by which a firm's managers make decisions about the firm's pursuit of sustained competitive advantage, given its limited resources and its competitive environment. In other words, strategic management discusses the way that people determine the overall strategy that the firm will adopt and the initiatives that it will use to compete in its industry. A strategy is the initiative. Strategic management considers the decision-making that creates those initiatives. While there are many ways to describe the strategic management process, one way is to break it down into 5 steps. A firm's business definition captures the essence of a firm. It describes the firm's core offerings and its market presence, often through mission and vision statements. A key purpose of the business definition is to specify clear boundaries between the activities that a firm chooses to engage in and those that it doesn't. For example, Nordstrom's is one of the most successful high-end retailers in our country. When you hear the name Nordstrom's, I imagine that you have a pretty good idea of what you would find at one of its stores, such as fashionable clothes. It also sells very nice homewares, like you would find on a wedding registry. But what if you heard that it was going to start selling appliances or tools at its stores? That just wouldn't fit with your image of Nordstrom's. So its business definition includes high-end items for a home, but not basic goods like appliances. An organization's goals and objectives essentially help managers translate the mission and vision statements into observable metrics. There are 2 things to note here. First, the right goals and objectives should be derived from the firm's business definition. What the firm aims at should be aligned with how it positions itself in the marketplace. Second, and relatedly, there isn't one right set of goals for all firms to pursue. Some firms may prioritize revenue growth, others profitability, others expansion into new markets. Determining which goals are best for a firm is entirely up to its primary stakeholders, which we'll discuss at the end of this presentation. Strategy formulation is the most thoughtful stage in the strategic management process. This is where managers gather data and make observations about their competitive context and the resources controlled by the firm, and then create plans for strategic action. Doing a great job with analysis and planning requires not only left-brain analytical power, but also creativity, insight, and a bit of gumption. The best strategic managers are able to muscle through the data analysis, put a finger on the pulse of broader competitive contexts, and then build creative responses to strategic challenges and opportunities. Once the firm has determined what it wants to do, the next step is to implement those strategies efficiently and effectively. Strategy implementation is all about getting things done. The last step in strategic management is evaluation, or reviewing performance and learning opportunities in all 4 of the previous stages. Engaging with strategic decisions is a never-ending process for senior managers, and they are always on the lookout for things they could improve. Moving on to perspectives on strategic performance. Performance is the unifying concept in strategy. In fact, a very good idea as you move through this course is to consider how everything you see impacts performance. Draw a bright line between them. Each of the elements of strategic analysis, both internal and external, and the prescriptive goals that are set by senior managers are inputs into strategic decisions, which then result in actions and investments which are trained on improving the organization's performance, however it is defined. Knowing how and why a firm experiences the level of performance that it does is the core purpose of studying strategy. Because each firm can pursue performance on its own terms, defining and measuring performance is a vital step. As we will see when we discuss stakeholders in the last few slides of this presentation, how the leaders of an organization view performance is completely up to them. Managers can choose to pursue any number of outcomes, as previously mentioned, and managers are often tasked with pursuing multiple goals at once, even ones that require trade-offs between them. But regardless of how an organization's leaders choose to define performance or select goals, targeted outcomes of strategic activities should share some characteristics. First, performance must be sustained. The best firms win consistently over time. Next, strategic performance is measured at the level of the entire firm, not on the performance of any one department or function. This will have important ramifications when we discuss organizational structure and strategic activity systems in later chapters. Third, performance is relative to customers and competitors. Not only does a firm's performance have to meet its own expectations, it also must meet the expectations of its customers and win against competitors. Last, performance is specified. It is never good enough to simply say, "We're going to be successful." A firm's pursuit of performance must be measurable and targeted. In all, it is important to note that these 4 perspectives on performance do not specify what measures of performance to pursue. All kinds of goals can meet these standards. And before we move into a discussion of stakeholders, we need a bit of background, a little history lesson from strategy. Kenneth Andrews, a Harvard professor back in the 60s and 70s, was one of the founders of the field of strategic management. He created the graphic on this slide to encourage managers to see strategic decisions from a variety of perspectives. He divided the contexts in which strategic decisions are made between economic and societal factors and internal and external factors. The top 2 boxes should look familiar. This graphic is the origin of the SWOT analysis. The company's strengths and weaknesses he defined as what a company can do or what it's possible for the company to do, and opportunities and threats focus on what a company might do or what's available to it in its industry. Those 2 boxes automatically come to mind when making strategic decisions, but keep the bottom 2 boxes in mind as well. As a general rule, we typically assume that firms fundamentally pursue financial returns, especially shareholder wealth, but there are plenty of examples in which organizations are run not just for money or business outcomes, but for other reasons as well. For instance, someone might start a business simply because they enjoy the product or service that the business creates. Members of a family business may sacrifice some financial returns but get the opportunity to work with one another. Nonprofit organizations and government agencies can utilize strategic management even if their key outcomes are not profit-based. In all, this box prompts us to think about what the most important stakeholders really want from the business. On the other side, we have broader societal expectations. This encourages us to remember that firms can make choices about how they will interact with the communities in which their business activities take place. Some firms choose to be highly active in their communities by donating to charities or philanthropies or by sponsoring volunteerism. This box represents how firms respond to and engage with non-business entities. Together, the bottom 2 boxes represent how the wishes of a firm's primary stakeholders impact its strategic decisions. And now on to stakeholders. I'll use the textbook Stakeholder Impact Analysis framework in this discussion. The first step in a stakeholder analysis is to identify which stakeholders exist. And the book does a pretty good job of identifying potential internal and external stakeholders. All of these types of entities can have a material interest in the behaviors and performance of the firm. The second step of the impact analysis is to identify each stakeholder's interests. For instance, employees want to make good money at jobs they are confident will continue to exist. Customers want great products and services at reasonable prices. Shareholders want strong returns, and communities want their firms to be positive contributors to their neighborhoods. This step considers what each stakeholder wants for itself. The third step of identifying opportunities and threats arising from stakeholders revolves on identifying instances in which the interests of different stakeholders interact, possibly even compete with one another. For instance, notice that the primary interests of employees, shareholders, and customers are not necessarily compatible with one another. When these conflicts exist, managers have to determine which stakeholders' interests have priority. They do so by noting the power, legitimacy, and urgency of a stakeholder's claim on the firm. Those with deeper interests will have a bigger impact on a firm's decisions. Note as well that the impact of a stakeholder group can vary over time and circumstance. For instance, the media will typically be a low-impact stakeholder. However, if a firm gets caught up in some sort of controversy, managing the press will quickly take higher priority. The fourth step of the stakeholder impact analysis involves determining the nature of the firm's engagement with society. This comes straight out of the lower right-hand box of Andrew's strategic context. The book goes through a pyramid of types of social responsibilities: economic, legal, ethical, and philanthropic. Please refer to the textbook for details on each. It is important to recognize that each firm can choose how it will interact with these types of responsibilities once they've met basic standards. For example, some firms give generously to philanthropic and charitable organizations, while others do very little. It's entirely up to them. And the last element of the impact analysis is addressing stakeholder concerns. This is the lower left box of the Andrews strategic context. And this goes back to the idea that stakeholders can have competing interests and managers are going to have to maneuver on how to respond to them. A firm's leaders can rarely satisfy every stakeholder, so they must make choices about how to balance the firm's response to each of them, making decisions that they believe will lead to the greatest levels of overall performance. In doing so, leaders articulate which stakeholders take precedence, what initiatives and investments they will choose to pursue, and which things they will sacrifice. To summarize the presentation, we started with key terms in the field of strategy. Please make sure you know these definitions. We will utilize them throughout the course. We then made some observations about organizational performance, which is the ultimate objective of strategy. And last, we discussed stakeholders, particularly how the most important stakeholders can influence how a firm defines performance and makes business decisions. With that, we close Chapter 1.